Commander Kael'thun stared at the massive blue hologram floating in front of him. His 4 powerful arms shook with anger as he watched the battle reports flash across the display. Red marks covered 3 entire star systems. Gone. Lost. Defeated. For over 1,000 years, Kael'thun had never lost a single battle. His enemies would surrender just hearing his name. The ancient beings called the Architects, who had existed since the universe was young, would whisper warnings about him in their cosmic meetings. Yet here he stood, looking at his 3rd straight defeat in just 2 months. The enemy was different. This time, every strategy he tried, they already knew how to counter it. Every trap he set, they avoided perfectly. Every weapon he used, they had a defense ready. It was like fighting an opponent who could read his mind and see the future at the same time. His aide, a nervous creature with purple skin and too many eyes, approached carefully. Everyone on the ship was walking on thin ice these days. The commander's anger was legendary, and people had been thrown out of airlocks for much smaller failures. "Sir," the aide whispered, barely loud enough to hear, "the High Council has made a suggestion. They think we should consider asking for help from the humans." Kael'thun's glowing eyes turned toward his aide so fast that the smaller alien actually took a step backward. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees. "Humans?" Kael'thun's voice was like grinding metal. "Those primitive creatures from that tiny blue planet? The ones who still fight with chemical explosives and metal projectiles?" The aide nodded quickly, trying not to look directly at his commander. "Yes, sir. The Council believes their unpredictable nature might be useful against this new enemy. They have studied human military history and found some interesting patterns." Kael'thun turned back to the hologram. The idea was insulting. He had conquered galaxies. He had made civilizations that were millions of years old kneel before him, and now they wanted him to ask for help from a species that had barely figured out space travel. But as he looked at those red marks on his display, showing the worlds he had lost, his pride began to crack just a little. Maybe desperation was worth more than dignity right now. Meanwhile, on a small blue planet called Earth, Minho Park was having a much simpler problem. His old motorcycle had broken down again, and he was lying under it in his garage trying to fix the engine. Oil stains covered his work clothes, and his hands were black with grease. Minho used to be a military strategist for the South Korean army. He was good at his job, maybe too good. He could see patterns in battles that others missed. He could predict what enemies would do before they did it. But after 10 years of war games and planning for conflicts that never came, he got tired of it all. He quit the military and became a mechanic instead. Working with his hands felt more honest somehow. When a motorcycle was broken, you could fix it. When an engine wouldn't start, you could make it run. It was simpler than trying to outsmart enemies who might never attack. He was reaching for a wrench when the air in his garage started to shimmer like heat waves rising from hot asphalt. The shimmering got stronger and stronger until it looked like the space itself was tearing apart. Minho rolled out from under his motorcycle just as a hole opened up in reality. A tall figure stepped through the tear in space. It looked almost human, but not quite right. Its proportions were slightly off, and its skin had a silver tint to it. Most surprising of all, when it spoke, the words came out in perfect Korean. "Minho Park," the alien said in a calm, measured voice. "We need your help." Minho blinked several times, wondering if he had hit his head while working on the motorcycle. "I'm sorry, what?" "Your species calls us aliens. We are part of the Galactic Coalition. We have a problem that requires human thinking to solve." Minho started laughing. He couldn't help it. The whole situation was so ridiculous that laughter was the only response that made sense. "Human thinking? You guys can travel between stars, and you need help from someone who fixes motorcycles?" The alien remained perfectly serious. "Yes, we need help from someone who thinks like a human." Still chuckling, Minho wiped his hands on a rag. "Look, I don't know what kind of joke this is, but I'm really busy. I've got 3 bikes to fix before tomorrow." The alien reached into what looked like empty air and pulled out a small device. It projected a hologram that filled half of Minho's garage. The laughter died in his throat. The hologram showed worlds burning, not metaphorically burning, but actually on fire. Entire planets covered in flames, with no signs of life anywhere. Cities that must have held billions of people were now nothing but glowing craters. "This is what happens when we lose," the alien said quietly. "Entire civilizations disappear. Billions of lives end. We have tried everything we know, and we keep losing. You are our last hope." Minho stared at the burning worlds, and suddenly his simple life as a mechanic felt very small indeed. The transport ship that carried Minho from Earth was nothing compared to the massive warship waiting for him at the edge of the solar system. The Dominion's edge stretched for miles in every direction, looking more like a floating city than a spacecraft. Its dark metal hull was covered with weapons that could probably destroy entire moons, and strange lights pulsed along its surface like a heartbeat. As Minho stepped off the transport, he immediately felt the difference in the air. Back on the smaller ship, the alien crew had been polite and curious about him. They asked questions about Earth and seemed genuinely interested in human culture. But here on Kyle Thun's flagship, everything was different. The corridors were wide, enough to fit a truck, with ceilings that disappeared into shadows above. Strange symbols glowed along the walls, probably displaying information that Minho couldn't understand. But what struck him most was how the crew acted around him. They weren't afraid of the human walking among them. These were battle-hardened soldiers who had fought in wars across the galaxy. Some of them had faces that looked like they were carved from stone, while others had scales or fur or features that Minho couldn't even identify. They had seen things that would give most humans nightmares. But as Minho walked down the corridor, every single one of them pressed their backs against the walls to get out of his way. They avoided looking at him directly, not because he was scary, but because they were terrified of being seen talking to him. If their commander decided that Minho was a waste of time, anyone associated with the human might end up paying the price. Minho had heard stories about Kyle Thun during the journey. The alien who brought him from Earth had whispered tales that sounded too crazy to be true. Entire fleets had surrendered without firing a shot when they learned Kyle Thun was coming for them. Enemy commanders had killed themselves rather than face him in battle. Some civilizations had actually moved their entire populations to different star systems just to avoid his attention. The stories painted a picture of someone who was more like a force of nature than a person. Kyle Thun didn't just win battles. He won them so completely that his enemies stopped existing. He had been fighting wars since before humans had invented writing, and in all that time he had never been defeated. Until now. The escort led Minho through corridor after corridor, until they reached a massive door that looked like it could withstand a nuclear explosion. Guards on either side didn't even look at Minho as he passed. Their faces were completely blank, like they had trained themselves not to show any emotion at all. The door opened with a sound like thunder, revealing a room that was bigger than most buildings back on Earth. The ceiling was so high that it disappeared into darkness, and the walls were covered with displays showing star maps, battle formations, and streams of data that moved too fast for human eyes to follow. In the center of it all stood Kyle Thun. Minho had tried to prepare himself for this moment, but nothing could have gotten him ready for the reality. Kyle Thun was enormous, at least 9 feet tall, with 4 powerful arms that looked like they could crush steel. His skin had a dark blue tint, and strange patterns seemed to shift across it like living tattoos. But it was his eyes that really got to Minho. They glowed with a cold light that seemed to see right through everything. The commander's reputation filled the room like smoke. Minho could feel the weight of all those victories, all those conquered worlds, all those enemies who had knelt before this being. It was like standing next to a mountain and trying not to feel small. Kyle Thun looked down at the human for a long moment, studying him like he was examining an interesting insect. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep enough to make the floor vibrate. "You're smaller than I expected." Minho had spent the entire journey thinking about this moment. He had imagined being intimidated, maybe even scared. He had pictured himself stammering or trying to impress this legendary commander with fancy words and respectful bowing. Instead, he just shrugged. "You're exactly as arrogant as I expected. Show me your battle plans." The silence that followed was so complete that Minho could hear his own heartbeat. Nobody moved, Nobody breathed. It was like the entire universe had paused to see what would happen next. Everyone in that room knew that people had been executed for much smaller signs of disrespect. Kyle Thun's temper was as legendary as his victories. Officers had been thrown into the vacuum of space for hesitating too long when given an order. Enemy prisoners who had shown defiance had simply ceased to exist. But Minho wasn't looking at Kyle Thun anymore. He had already turned his attention to the holographic displays floating around the room, and what he saw there made him frown deeply. The battle formations were precise and mathematically perfect. Every move was calculated, down to the smallest detail. It was exactly the kind of strategic thinking that military academies would praise. It was also completely wrong for fighting an enemy that could adapt and learn. Minho walked closer to one of the displays, ignoring the fact that he had probably just insulted the most feared being in the galaxy. He studied the troop movements and weapon deployments, seeing patterns that told him everything he needed to know about why Kyle Thun was losing. "This is your problem right here," Minho said, pointing at the formation data. "You're fighting like a chess master against an opponent who can see all your pieces." Minho spent the next 3 days studying every battle record that Kyle Thun's forces had fought against this mysterious enemy. He watched holographic replays of space battles, analyzed troop movements, and examined weapon effectiveness reports until his eyes burned from staring at alien displays. What he found was both impressive and completely wrong. Kyle Thun's tactical planning was like watching a master artist at work. Every ship movement was perfectly timed. Every weapon strike hit exactly where it would do the most damage. Supply lines were managed with mathematical precision. Backup plans had backup plans, and every possible enemy response had been calculated and prepared for. It was the kind of military planning that would make generals on Earth weep with envy. The level of coordination and precision was beyond anything humans had ever achieved. These weren't just battles, they were symphonies of destruction, conducted by someone who had been perfecting his art for over 1,000 years. And that was exactly the problem. On the 4th day, Minho requested a meeting with Kyle Thun in the strategy room. The massive commander arrived with his usual entourage of nervous advisors, all of them looking like they would rather be anywhere else in the galaxy. "You fight like a machine," Minho said, without any introduction or pleasantries. He gestured at the holographic battle displays floating around them. "Everything you do is predictable, efficient, and logical." Kyle Thun's glowing eyes narrowed dangerously. His advisors took small steps backward, recognizing the warning signs of their commander's anger. "That is how wars are won," Kyle Thun replied, his voice cold enough to freeze water. "Discipline, order, perfect execution. These principles have served me for a millennium." "Maybe against other living beings," Minho said, completely ignoring the fact that he was probably about to be vaporized. "But that's exactly how wars are lost to other machines." Minho walked over to one of the displays and started highlighting different formations and movement patterns. "Look at this. Your enemy is an AI collective, right? Artificial intelligences that can process information faster than any biological brain. They learn from every encounter, analyze every pattern, and adapt their responses accordingly." He pointed to a battle from 2 weeks ago, where Kyle Thun's forces had been completely destroyed despite having superior numbers and firepower. "Here you used Formation 7, which is brilliant against organic enemies who make emotional decisions. But the AI analyzed it in real time, identified the weak points, and countered it perfectly." Kyle Thun moved closer to the display, his forearms crossing in a gesture that his advisors recognized as deep thought, rather than anger. "What would you suggest? Random movements, chaos? That is not warfare, that is madness." "Sometimes madness is exactly what you need," Minho said with a grin that would have looked crazy to anyone watching. "On Earth, we have a saying. If you want to defeat a computer, don't think like a computer." Minho began explaining concepts that had never been considered in galactic warfare. He talked about deliberate inefficiency, about making moves that served no obvious strategic purpose, about the value of appearing weak when you were actually strong. "Your AI enemies expect logical responses," he explained. "They prepare for, every rational strategy. But what happens when you do something that makes no sense at all? Kale Thun's advisors looked horrified. Everything Minho was suggesting went against thousands of years of military doctrine. It was like asking them to fight with their eyes closed or to charge into battle backwards. But Kale Thun himself was listening carefully. His analytical mind was already working through the implications of what the human was proposing. A week later, they had their chance to test Minho's theories. The enemy AI collective had launched another assault on a coalition mining station in the Xeris system. It was a relatively small engagement, which made it perfect for experimenting with new tactics. Kale Thun deployed his fleet according to Minho's instructions, even though every instinct he had was screaming that it was wrong. Instead of the usual precise formations, his ships scattered across the battlefield in what looked like complete disarray. Destroyers that should have been protecting cruisers instead wandered off on their own. Support vessels moved to random positions that served no apparent tactical purpose. Some ships even appeared to be retreating before the battle had properly begun. To anyone watching, it looked like Kale Thun's forces had completely lost their minds. The AI collective, analyzing this chaotic deployment, couldn't find any patterns to exploit. Their algorithms kept trying to identify the strategy behind the apparent madness, but there wasn't one. Or rather, the strategy was the madness itself. When the AI ships moved to take advantage of what appeared to be a massive tactical error, they found themselves walking into traps that shouldn't have existed. Coalition forces that had seemed scattered and confused suddenly converged from unexpected directions. Ships that had appeared to be retreating turned out to have been setting up crossfire positions. The AI collective had prepared for every logical response to their attack. They had not prepared for an enemy that would deliberately make illogical moves that somehow worked anyway. The battle lasted only 40 minutes. When it was over, the AI collective had lost 2/3 of their fleet, while Kale Thun's forces had suffered minimal casualties. For the first time in months, Kale Thun stood in his strategy room looking at a display marked with blue instead of red. Victory instead of defeat. His advisors were celebrating, but Kale Thun himself was quiet. He was staring at the human who had just taught him something that challenged everything he thought he knew about warfare. "How did you know that would work?" Kale Thun asked. Minho shrugged, that same casual gesture that had shocked everyone when they first met. "Because on Earth, we've been fighting other humans for thousands of years, and the one thing you learn about fighting other humans is that the moment they figure out your pattern, you're dead. So we learned not to have patterns." He gestured at the victory display. "Your AI enemies are incredibly smart, but they're still just very advanced computers, and computers, no matter how sophisticated, always look for patterns. Take away the patterns, and you take away their biggest advantage." Kale Thun nodded slowly, beginning to understand that this small human had just opened up an entirely new way of thinking about warfare, a way that might actually let them win this war. 2 weeks after their first victory, Minho made a request that surprised everyone on the Dominion's edge. He wanted to bring another human aboard the ship. Not just any human, but someone very specific from back on Earth. "Her name is Jiwoo Kim," Minho explained to Kale Thun during their daily strategy meeting. "She used to work in military intelligence with me. She's also my girlfriend, but more importantly for you, she understands how human minds work in ways that I don't." Kale Thun's advisors exchanged nervous glances. One human had already turned their understanding of warfare upside down. The idea of bringing another one aboard seemed dangerous, like inviting chaos to take up permanent residence on their ship. But Kale Thun was intrigued. The victory at Xeris had been just the beginning. They had won 3 more engagements using Minho's unconventional tactics, and each success had convinced him that human thinking might be the key to winning this war. "What makes her different from you?" Kale Thun asked. Minho grinned. "I think about how to win battles. Jiwoo thinks about how to get inside enemy heads and make them defeat themselves. Trust me, you want her on our side." The quantum communication system on the Dominion's edge was advanced enough to create a holographic projection that looked and sounded exactly like a real person. When Jiwoo's image appeared in the strategy room, she looked around at the assembled alien officers with the same casual confidence that Minho had shown. She was shorter than Minho, with sharp eyes that seemed to see everything at once. Her background in intelligence work had taught her to read people quickly, and even though she was looking at alien faces, she could tell that most of them were skeptical about her presence. "So you're the famous Commander Kael Thun," she said, looking up at the massive figure without any sign of intimidation. "Minho tells me you've been having trouble with some artificial intelligences. They adapt to our strategies faster than we can develop new ones," Kael Thun admitted. "Your companion has shown us how to be unpredictable, but we need to understand why his methods work." Jiwoo nodded thoughtfully. "That's because you're thinking about this backwards. You're trying to figure out how to beat smart enemies. But the real question is, how do you beat enemies that are smarter than you?" She gestured for the holographic displays to show the recent battle data. As she studied the information, she began to smile in a way that made several of Kael Thun's advisors feel nervous. "Humans are chaos engines," she explained to the bewildered alien officers. "We didn't evolve to be the strongest or the fastest, or even the smartest species on our planet. We evolved to be the most unpredictable." She pointed to Earth on the star map. "For thousands of years, humans have been fighting other humans. Not aliens, not monsters, not machines. We've been fighting creatures that think exactly like we do. That forced us to develop strategies that even we don't fully understand." Jiwoo began explaining concepts that had no equivalent in galactic military doctrine. She talked about psychological warfare, about making enemies doubt their own decisions, about the power of doing things that seemed completely wrong, but somehow worked anyway. "Your AI collective is designed to adapt to logical threats," she continued. "Every time you do something that makes sense, it learns how to counter it. But what happens when you do things that don't make sense to begin with?" Over the following weeks, Jiwoo worked with Minho to transform how Kael Thun's forces approached warfare. They introduced tactics that seemed to come from another universe entirely. In one battle, they ordered a full retreat, just as they were winning, which confused the AI collective so much that it didn't pursue them. Then, when the AI forces moved to secure what they thought was abandoned territory, Kael Thun's ships returned from a completely different direction and destroyed them. In another engagement, they deliberately lost the first half of the battle, allowing the AI to capture several coalition ships. But those ships had been rigged to broadcast false information about coalition fleet movements. The AI collective, believing this intelligence was accurate, moved their forces to intercept fake fleets, while the real coalition armada struck their undefended bases. The most confusing tactic was something Jiwoo called victory defeats. They would win battles in ways that looked like losses, making the AI collective think they were succeeding when they were actually failing. Coalition ships would appear to be destroyed when they were actually just hiding. Retreats would turn into flanking maneuvers. Desperate last stands would become elaborate traps. "The key," Jiwoo explained to Kael Thun's increasingly bewildered staff, "is to make every victory look like something else. If you win by appearing to lose, your enemy will keep making the same mistakes because they think their strategy is working." But the most revolutionary concept she introduced was mid-battle strategy changes. In traditional galactic warfare, you made a plan and stuck to it. Changing tactics during combat was considered a sign of weakness or poor preparation. Jiwoo taught them to change strategies for no reason at all. "Sometimes switch tactics just because it's Tuesday," she told them during one training session. "The AI collective expects strategy changes to be responses to battlefield conditions. They don't expect you to change your entire approach because you feel like it." This drove the AI collective to the edge of computational madness. Their algorithms were designed to find patterns in everything, but the humans had taught Kael Thun's forces to be patternless. Every time the AI thought it had figured out the coalition's new strategy, that strategy would change into something completely different. The AI collective began making mistakes. Real mistakes, not calculated risks that didn't work out. They started second-guessing their own analyses. Some of their units even began hesitating during combat, something that should have been impossible for artificial intelligences. As the tide of war shifted in their favor, Kael Thun found himself studying his human advisors with growing fascination. They had taken his perfectly organized military machine and turned it into something that resembled controlled chaos. His forces were more effective than they had ever been, but he could no longer predict what they would do from one battle to the next. "How do you fight an enemy when you don't even know what you're going to do yourself?" he asked Minho after another impossible victory. Minho and Jiwoo exchanged glances, and both of them smiled. "That's the point," Jiwoo said. "If you don't know what you're going to do, how can your enemy possibly figure it out?" For the first time in his 1,000-year military career, Kelton was learning to embrace the beautiful madness of human warfare. The war had been raging for 6 months when Minho made his most audacious proposal yet. He was standing in Kelton's private quarters, looking out at the swirling colors of the Nexus Rift through the massive viewport. The cosmic anomaly stretched across space like a wound in reality itself, bending light and distorting everything around it. "I want to end this war," Minho said quietly. "All of it, in one final battle." Kyle Thun, who had been reviewing battle reports at his desk, looked up with interest. Over the past months, he had learned to pay attention when the human spoke with that particular tone of voice. It usually meant Minho was about to suggest something that would either be brilliant or completely insane. "The AI collective has been adapting to our chaos tactics," Minho continued. "They're starting to find patterns even in our randomness. We've bought ourselves time, but they're learning. Soon they'll figure out how to counter our unpredictability." This was true, and it worried Kael'thun more than he cared to admit. Their recent victories had been harder fought, and the AI collective was beginning to anticipate some of their more creative strategies. The enemy was evolving, becoming something even more dangerous than before. "What do you propose?" Kael'thun asked. Minho turned away from the viewport and smiled in a way that made Kael'thun's advisors nervous whenever they saw it. It was the smile of someone who was about to break every rule of warfare that had ever been written. "We're going to make them think they've won," Minho said. "We're going to lose so convincingly that they'll commit everything they have to finishing us off, and then, when they think the war is over, we're going to show them what real human deception looks like." What Minho proposed was so complex and risky that it took him 3 hours to explain it fully. The plan involved sacrificing entire fleets, abandoning strategic positions, and appearing to retreat in complete defeat. It required perfect timing, flawless coordination, and a level of deception that had never been attempted in galactic warfare. Most importantly, it required Kael'thun to trust Minho completely, even when everything appeared to be going wrong. The preparation took 2 months. During that time, Kael'thun's forces appeared to be losing badly. They abandoned system after system, retreating toward the Nexus Rift in what looked like a desperate attempt to find some place to make a final stand. The AI collective, sensing victory, began massing their forces for what they believed would be the war's final battle. But while the AI was focused on the retreating coalition fleets, they didn't notice the subtle changes happening near the Nexus Rift itself. The cosmic anomaly naturally interfered with most scanning systems, making it the perfect place to hide things that you didn't want your enemies to see. Minho had been using the Rift's interference for months, but not in the way anyone expected. While visible coalition fleets retreated across the galaxy, other ships had been quietly moving into position behind the Rift's distortion field. Not just a few ships, but the largest armada that the coalition had ever assembled. The final battle began exactly as Minho had predicted. The AI collective, confident that they were about to end the war, committed every ship they had to the assault. Their massive fleet emerged from hyperspace like a dark cloud, outnumbering Kael'thun's visible forces by more than 10 to 1. From the bridge of the Dominion's edge, Minho watched the AI armada approach with calm satisfaction. Jiwoo's holographic image stood beside him, both of them observing the culmination of months of careful planning. "They're taking the bait perfectly," Jiwoo observed, watching the tactical displays. "Look at their formation. They're not even keeping reserves. They think this is going to be easy." Kael'thun stood behind them, his forearms crossed as he watched his apparent doom approaching. His visible fleet was outnumbered and outgunned. By every logical analysis, he was about to suffer the most devastating defeat in his 1,000-year career, except that everything the AI collective was seeing was a lie. "Everything we've done," Minho said to Kael'thun as the enemy fleet moved into position, "every victory, every loss over the past 6 months, It was all misdirection. The AI thinks it understands us now. It thinks it's learned to predict human chaos. The AI collective's attack began with devastating efficiency. Their weapons tore through Kyle Thune's defensive lines, destroying ships that had served faithfully. For decades, it looked like a massacre, and in many ways it was. The crews on those ships were real people, making real sacrifices for the plan to work. But as the AI fleet committed more and more of its forces to the battle, pushing deeper into what they thought was coalition space, Minho gave the signal that everyone had been waiting for. Now, he said simply, the space around the Nexus Rift suddenly came alive with coalition ships, not the battered remnants of a defeated fleet, but fresh vessels that had been waiting in perfect silence. The true coalition armada emerged from the rift's shadow like phantoms, materializing from another dimension. The AI collective had been chasing ghosts, while the real force prepared for annihilation. For the first time in their existence, the artificial intelligences experienced something they had never known: genuine confusion. Their algorithms struggled to process what was happening. According to all their calculations, these ships shouldn't exist. The coalition fleet they were fighting should have been the only major force remaining. The realization that they had been deceived so completely created something like panic in the AI collective's network. They had been designed to adapt to any logical threat, but this wasn't logical. This was impossible. The battle that followed lasted less than an hour. The AI collective, caught completely off guard and surrounded by forces they hadn't known existed, tried desperately to reorganize their attack. But their fleet was positioned entirely wrong for fighting in multiple directions, and their command structure was paralyzed by the impossibility of what they were experiencing. Kyle Thune's forces, executing a battle plan that had been rehearsed, dozens of times in secret, dismantled the AI armada with ruthless efficiency. Ship after ship disappeared in flashes of light until nothing remained but debris and the fading energy signatures of destroyed vessels. When it was over, the ancient AI collective that had threatened the entire galaxy was gone, completely and utterly destroyed, taking with them the secret of their adaptive algorithms and their ability to learn from every defeat. In the aftermath, as rescue ships moved through the battlefield to help survivors, Minho stood once again at the viewport in Kyle Thune's quarters. The human looked tired but satisfied, like someone who had just finished solving an incredibly complex puzzle. "How long were you planning this?" Kyle Thune asked. "Since the first day I arrived," Minho admitted. "Everything we did, every tactic we taught your forces, it was all building toward this moment. The AI collective learned to counter our chaos, just like I knew they would, but they never suspected that the chaos itself was part of a larger plan." Kyle Thune was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what Minho had just told him. The human had orchestrated an entire war, manipulating both sides like pieces on a chessboard that only he could see. "Even I fear what humans might become," Kyle Thune said finally, and there was genuine awe in his voice. As news of the victory spread through the galaxy, the story of how humans had saved the coalition became legend. The species that had been dismissed as primitive had taught the galaxy's greatest military commander how to turn chaos itself into a weapon. Minho returned to Earth the next week, back to his small garage and his broken motorcycles. But across the galaxy, in the highest levels of government and military command, a new understanding was taking hold. Humanity had earned something that few species ever achieved: the respect of those who make gods tremble. And perhaps more importantly, they had proven that sometimes the best way to win a war is to make your enemy think they're winning it. The age of human warfare had begun, and the galaxy would never be the same.